Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management will come to order. Chair asks unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. Chair also asks unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. Chair now recognizes himself for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes. I want to thank our witness, Ms. Victoria Salinas, the senior official performing the duties of Deputy Administrator for FEMA's Office of Resilience, for being here today. Today's hearing will focus on examining the costs and benefit of FEMA's increasing emphasis on mitigation. FEMA provides hazard mitigation funding to state, tribal, and territorial governments through several grant programs, including the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. FEMA also provides hazard mitigation funding through its public assistance and individual assistance programs. FEMA reported that in fiscal year 2023, it had obligated more than $2.93 billion in funding for hazard mitigation grants. Going further back in time, FEMA obligated more than $1.78 billion in fiscal year 2022, more than $2.34 billion in fiscal year 2021, more than $1.31 billion in fiscal year 2020, and more than $1.16 billion in fiscal year 2019. I know the numbers kind of make people's eyes glaze over, but that means over the past 5 fiscal years, FEMA has obligated more than $9.5 billion for mitigation grant funding. That's a lot of money. That's not counting for all mitigation assistance spent in the years prior. And given this huge sum of money, obviously, we have several concerns. First, despite literally spending billions of dollars on mitigation work, FEMA continues to ask Congress for more money. It is my understanding that FEMA is once again asking for supplemental funding for the Disaster Relief Fund, which is estimated to run out of money sometime this summer. And while FEMA claims that hazard mitigation funding will reduce the cost of disasters, FEMA continues to spend billions of dollars per disaster. So we're looking for where's the cost benefit, how does the investment actually equal lower or less dollars being spent. FEMA's 2023 National Preparedness Report stated that between January 2020 and December of 22, there were 60 climate-related disasters costing at least $1 billion each. We fail to see how the $9.5 billion in mitigation funding has significantly saved our taxpayers' dollar. I'm not even sure significantly is the right word, but we're also concerned that the types of mitigation projects that FEMA is choosing to fund, we're concerned about them. And reviewing some of the more recent mitigation projects approved by FEMA, terms like nature-based solutions and climate resilience appear in many of the project descriptions. FEMA is funding projects to plant trees and improve habitat for wildlife, which is all very nice, but I'm not sure it's part of the core mission and something we need to be spending tax dollars on. None of this, or as none of this, is within the scope of responsibility of FEMA's mission. And if that's where FEMA is funneling our taxpayer funds, is the agency really achieving the stated goals of these mitigation grants, which is to reduce disaster costs and save lives? Further, concerningly, FEMA has continued to struggle to make hazard mitigation funding available to the communities that need it the most. The application process to receive mitigation grants is complicated. So complex, in fact, it creates real challenges for small communities attempting to apply for these funds, and those who can't afford to hire grant writers are the ones that are at a loss. We see that wealthier states with the means to pay for outside consultants and grant writers successfully receive FEMA funds, while smaller states are passed over. Are these funds truly being focused on reducing risk where it is most needed? So what I really want to know is how FEMA is awarding these funds. Is the agency actually targeting investments to strategically counter the effect of natural disasters? Or is it simply funneling money to states that have the resources available to jump through the hurdles and complete the application process? FEMA's BRIC program is a prime illustration of those concerns. For the first 3 years of funding, 5 states accounting for 30% of the nation's population received 50%, half through the BRIC, whereas 24 smaller states accounting for 21% of the nation's population combined were only awarded 5% of BRIC funding. That's a pretty stark contrast. In fact, according to analysis done by outside groups, the San Francisco and New York metro area have been the most successful in applying for BRIC funding. Is there any accountability whatsoever for this? How can FEMA justify its allocation of funds? We want to discuss these questions with our witness today, and we want to dig into how FEMA determines which projects have the merit to receive mitigation funding and whether the process targets funding to projects that actually mitigate against disasters. FEMA can't solve everyone's problems, and if FEMA is going to fund mitigation, at the very least, the project should demonstrate they will actually reduce the cost of disasters. As a matter of fact, that's the point of it. With that, I look forward to hearing from our witness on these issues. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Salinas, for being here today to talk about FEMA's mitigation programs. Climate change and related severe weather events have changed the disaster landscape, and they are devastating communities of all sizes, rural, urban, across the country. Responding to these disasters really isn't enough. Proactive mitigation strategies are necessary to build resilience before disasters so communities have a chance to bounce back. Therefore, I'm proud of this committee's bipartisan history of supporting mitigation efforts with demonstrable returns on investment. In the past 5 years, FEMA's mitigation program, combination of programs, has grown substantially at Congress's direction to address these disaster impact trends and ensure public safety. In 2020, FEMA awarded the first round of BRIC grants, making unprecedented funding available to states before disasters to implement large and innovative programs. Last year, FEMA awarded the first capitalization grants for the Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund program, which was finally funded thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. Before these pre-disaster programs, FEMA's mitigation investments came almost entirely post-disaster through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This program remains critically important and still accounts for the largest percentage of FEMA's hazard mitigation spending, but the Safeguarding Tomorrow Fund and the BRIC program are finally providing communities the proactive tools they need. Since its authorization, FEMA has invested $4.5 billion in pre-disaster mitigation through the BRIC program, and state and local governments are demonstrating considerable demand, with the most recent funding opportunity being 5 times oversubscribed. Additional actions at the state and local level also indicate a growing interest in mitigation efforts to protect homes and infrastructure. States and cities from Mobile, Alabama to Minneapolis, Minnesota, including Clark County, Nevada, where my district is, are establishing hazard mitigation offices, resiliency centers, and chief resilience officers positions to strategically identify local mitigation opportunities. Now, talk about saving money. It's not surprising that investments in mitigation are proven to save money. Every $1 investigated in mitigation results in up to $13 saved post-disaster. We've also got to continue to prioritize the equitable distribution of these investments to disadvantaged communities that may be hit hardest by the disasters, take the longest to recover, and have the fewest resources to be able to do that. I've heard from these communities that they're often unable to successfully apply for the federal mitigation grant funding due to a lack of capacity and resources. And that's why I support President Biden's Justice 40 initiative to allocate 40% of BRIC and flood mitigation assistance grants to disadvantaged communities. And the Community Disaster Resilience Act, the Resilience Zone Act, led by Representative Davids here in the House, to identify census tracts that are most in need and most at risk to natural disasters. Finally, access to mitigation funding can't stop at the local level. I believe homeowners should have the chance to access mitigation funds to protect their families and their financial security. Unfortunately, homeowners can't often retrofit their homes with recommended mitigation measures because they're just too expensive. Last year, I filed a successful amendment to H.R. 5473 that will create a pilot program for making individual homes more resilient to all hazards. It's my hope that it will be enacted before the end of the year, so we'll have an opportunity to measure its effectiveness. Ms. Salinas, I thank you and your colleagues for your hard work to implement FEMA's growing suite of mitigation programs, and I look forward to more conversation about how this essential work not only saves taxpayer dollars, but improves public safety. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chair Perry and Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus for calling today's hearing. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the impact and performance of FEMA's hazard mitigation programs, especially as one of the counties in my district is still recovering and rebuilding from November 21 floods. Disaster costs taxpayers billions of dollars each year. Last year, climate and weather-related disasters caused over $92.9 billion in impacts nationwide. This figure is not an anomaly. In the past 5 years, the average annual cost of disasters in the U.S. was $119 billion. FEMA can help states and disaster survivors cover some recovery costs, but many disasters go undeclared, which means homeowners, farmers, business owners, and state and local governments are paying the majority of disaster damage bills. This slows economic growth and recovery. It's unsustainable as well for those who live in the path of increasingly frequent and severe disasters. So hazard mitigation does offer a solution. And according to the National Institute of Building Sciences, every $1 invested in hazard mitigation results in $13 saved. FEMA projects that nationwide adoption of modern building codes also would save $600 billion in disaster impacts by 2060. In order to reduce the cost of future disasters, Congress and FEMA have dramatically expanded the mitigation grant programs the agency offers. So before 2018, almost all of the mitigation funding FEMA provided was only available to states after a disaster. The creation of BRIC and the Safeguarding Tomorrow Loan Fund have changed that. Since 2020, FEMA has been able to award over $5 billion for mitigation projects before disaster strikes. This proactive approach is needed to protect communities, and I strongly support the additional investments that the bipartisan infrastructure law made in these programs. State and local demand for pre-disaster mitigation funding is very clear. FEMA's competitive pre-disaster mitigation program, the BRIC program, is consistently oversubscribed more than 4 times over. That's why it's important, that's why I support increasing the set-aside for the BRIC program from 6 to 15% of annual disaster relief fund spending. More money spent on resilience before disasters means less money spent on repairs after. Now, making federal funding available for mitigation projects is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Money needs to get out the door to eligible states and local governments in a timely manner, and the funds need to be accessible to the most disadvantaged communities. All new grant programs face some implementation challenges. The pre-disaster mitigation programs have not been an exception to that. According to information from FEMA, 77 award winners for the fiscal year 20 BRIC funding cycle and 112 applicants for the fiscal year 21 funding cycle have not yet received full funding. Now, FEMA needs to make sure those funds get out the door promptly. However, I am pleased with other efforts that FEMA has made to improve the BRIC application process by simplifying the benefit cost analysis requirements and offering technical assistance to disadvantaged communities. The positive impact of these changes is already noticeable, as the Resilience Office has reported receiving a greater number of applications from new applicants. So I look forward to discussing solutions to continue improving program efficiency and getting mitigation funding out the door faster into the hands of communities. The bipartisan infrastructure law is improving our nation's resilience by providing $5 billion to help communities proactively prepare for disasters, but there's still a long way to go. I applaud the administration's prioritization of resilience to keep communities safe and to reduce disaster recovery costs. So Ms. Salinas, I look forward to discussing with you how we can work together to make FEMA's mitigation programs even more effective in the future. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to the testimony. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair would now like to welcome our witness and thank her for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witness. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means to conclude your remarks. The chair asks unanimous consent that the witness's full statement be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Chair also asks unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witness has provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to her in writing without objection, so ordered. Chair also asks unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or the witness to be included in the record of today's hearing without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony, ma'am, has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Ms. Salinas, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you so much, and good morning. Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Larson, and Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about FEMA's evolving role in hazard mitigation. We value this subcommittee's legislative support and oversight of our agency, and I really look forward to today's conversation. Communities today face an increasing set of challenges, from atmospheric rivers to once-in-a-century fires. In 2023 alone, NOAA calculated that the U.S. sustained 28 disasters that each cost $1 billion or more. That's the most ever in a single year on record. At FEMA, our mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters, and our agency is spearheading efforts to bolster communities' ability to understand and fulfill their role related to increasing disaster resilience. Improved resilience saves lives, results in less complex recoveries, and helps break the disaster cycle. If we're going to help prepare our communities in the future, then we need to invest in the communities before a disaster strikes. One way FEMA is working to achieve this goal is through our suite of grant programs. Our Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program provides critical funding to invest in cost-effective activities that build a community's resilience while lowering future disaster costs. Despite historic funding levels across our programs, we continue to see more applications come in than funding is available each year. These programs are helping across our nation. For example, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, BRIC, for the FY22 grant cycle saw the largest BRIC notice of funding ever at $2.3 billion. We selected 50 states, 35 tribal nations, 4 territories, and the District of Columbia to receive funding pending final review of their projects. One example of these projects is from Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, where they are hardening power infrastructure to protect their community. This means that after a storm, not only will individuals and households be protected, but critical facilities too. State and local demand for project funding and technical assistance is only growing. Through the FY23 BRIC application cycle, we saw a record number of requests for BRIC direct technical assistance come in, with 164 submissions and asks for support from all 10 FEMA regions. Through this program, FEMA provides tailored support to communities and tribal nations that may not have resources to do the planning and project design on their own. FEMA has already announced for BRIC DTA 74 communities and tribal nations for the program, and this year we look to select another 80. Up-to-date building codes are another efficient and cost-effective way to safeguard our communities. Therefore, we also established a new set-aside, a plus-up in our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program in the FY23 grant cycle. And we saw $52 million worth of building codes-related projects come in. That's a record-breaking number for FEMA. Our portfolio of hazard mitigation grants also includes the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which provides funding to develop mitigation plans and retrofit in ways that reduce the impact of future disaster losses. We also provide capitalization grants for mitigation projects through the Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund. This new revolving loan fund is helping states, tribes, and territories finance projects to reduce risk. These funds can be used as required local match, which means that they can be used for match for even FEMA programs, providing additional flexibility to communities. This reduces and helps eliminate barriers for many small, rural, and other communities with limited capacities that they may face. Recently, FEMA and DHS also announced more than $1.8 billion in funding for our 8 FY24 preparedness grant programs that help stakeholders prevent and respond to acts of terrorism as well as hazards. Education and training are also key, and through our partnership with the National Domestic Preparedness Consortium, we offer over 190 trainings each year that are reaching thousands of emergency managers, first responders, and local leaders. FEMA is also working to bolster resilience through the establishment of community disaster resilience zones and announced the first 483 zones last September. These designations will leverage collaboration and cross-sector coordination across all levels of government, philanthropy, businesses, and academia. As we look to the challenges ahead, we are currently implementing changes to accelerate the grant programs and build capacity. FEMA looks forward to our continued work with this subcommittee to mitigate hazards and build a more resilient nation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to our conversation and your questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. We're going to turn to questions now. The chair is going to turn to himself. I'm curious, look, FEMA says so right in the name, right? The Federal Emergency Management Agency, emergency, right? So I'm looking at this publication, FEMA Economic Benefit Values for Green Infrastructure. Benefit values for green infrastructure under FEMA, July 2022. And I see in here, under green infrastructure benefit categories, one of the benefits is property value improvement for, I guess, well, this is one of the things we're striving for. And I'm wondering, are heat islands, is that an emergency? I guess this is mitigation when we talk about planting trees, right? Urban trees here, I see, and we'll get into some of the questioning about the value of that. But is that an emergency, and how much money are we spending on that?
We are, through our hazard mitigation grant program and our portfolio of grants, helping communities reduce the risk that they face. And so there's a number of eligible types of projects across our hazard mitigation grant portfolio. As you well know, many of our grant programs have a cost effectiveness requirement. So from the very get-go, when communities apply, we are looking at the benefit cost of the programs and projects that are being requested as part of the vetting before any funding is given to projects.
So I get that. I guess among other things, when I look at urban trees, I see the total benefit if you talk about things including property value improvement, stormwater volume and quality, the cost or the benefit is $1,055.19. And of course, it's all broken down here, but I do wonder, and I think the people paying the taxes wonder how you derive that benefit, number one. Well, maybe not number one. Number one is how is this an emergency? Like an emergency, something, you think about a disaster. I mean, if you live at certain places, flooding's probably an issue that you can anticipate. Hurricanes might be an anticipated emergency, wildfires. You can go through the list of things. Heat island, well, let me ask you this. How is FEMA mitigating emergencies and disasters by planting trees?
FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. And reducing disaster risk is one of the most critical ways that we help save lives, protect property, and ensure that communities can recover quickly after disasters. The types of events that communities are facing is changing dramatically. We are seeing heat domes, we are seeing wildfires, we're seeing flood following fire, a whole range of types of disasters. And the approaches to reducing disaster risk are varied. For instance, you've brought up trees and nature-based solutions. We are seeing that in communities across the country that there's a differential in heat depending on the topography. And so many communities that are seeking to really cool down neighborhoods because each year, even this last year, there was several hundred deaths because of extreme heat. And so that's one of the
So do we
emerging
know,
hazards.
ma'am, can you quantify how many deaths have been averted by planting these trees?
In the cost-benefit analysis.
Do people
and
stand out underneath the tree? What do they do? What's happening?
With many of the solutions that really rely on nature, Mother Nature, to protect and support communities, we've seen in different types of projects that the benefits are many. And as I mentioned—
I get that, and I wish you could quantify some of them. My time is quickly running out. We've talked a lot and said nothing, I think, unfortunately. Like, we want the results. Show me some results to any of this. I see that also we're spending a boatload of money in Puerto Rico on sustainable energy, and I saw the list of people that were involved in putting the program together, but I didn't see anybody there to talk about the fact that the last two hurricanes had sustained winds of 180 and 175, max sustained winds, 180 and 175 miles per hour. I've got a study here that shows the impact on solar panels begins at 56 miles per hour. And that's not to mention hail. I'll ask that this be entered into the record, this study. It seems to me we're just blowing money that we don't have while FEMA asks for more. And then finally, I look at the distribution of the BRIC funds state ranking. I've got DC here with 3 disasters, a declaration, including inauguration, like that's an emergency we didn't see coming, apparently. Meanwhile, you got Mississippi with 21. DC's way up here, getting all this money. Mississippi's way down here, getting none of this money. That's an issue, ma'am, that needs to be resolved, but I see my time has expired, so I am going to yield my time and recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things. When you're talking about measuring the results of mitigation, it's harder to measure something that doesn't happen than it is to measure something that does happen. And the purpose of mitigation is to keep things from happening. So it's not just so easy to come with a statistic that the chairman apparently is looking for. Also, representing Las Vegas, in the sunniest, hottest, driest state in the country, we have a great appreciation for heat islands and the damage that can be done to a community, to infrastructure, to individuals, to pets, because of this extreme heat. So planting trees does make a big difference in an area like that, and that can quickly lead to disaster. In some areas, it leads to fire, like I said, death, kind of devastation of a neighborhood. And so we appreciate the emphasis on some of these heat islands that apparently the chairman doesn't have in Pennsylvania. I did want to ask you, though, that my glasses broke, so I'm sorry. The BRIC program was 5 times oversubscribed. I mentioned that, and I think you may have mentioned it too, and that many of the applicants were the first time they had applied for one of these grants. I wonder if you could tell us kind of how that has evolved, if it's oversubscribed, what we can do, do you need more funds? Would you just go into a little more detail about that program? And being having so many applicants seems to me to be one indicator that it must be successful because people want to be part of it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And as you said, there has been a growing demand and realization across this nation of the need to take action and reduce risk. Part of that has been the well-studied return on investment that hazard mitigation has and our ongoing commitment to ensuring that all of the projects are cost-effective. And we're seeing that many communities are becoming first-time applicants, and we've been working very closely with them to be able to better access our programs. Some of those concrete things we're doing are dismantling the barriers to access federal funding. So for instance, over the last couple years, not only have we streamlined language in our notices of funding, we've become much more proactive in how we provide support. So you heard me mention direct technical assistance. The number of communities we're helping with that means that many of those are starting to now access competitive grants that they couldn't have accessed before. We've also been providing and changing requirements around the support we give to low-income communities for conducting benefit cost analysis, again, which is a requirement for all of our programs. It used to be an impediment, a barrier. People had to hire contractors in some cases. And because we recognize that low-income communities in rural areas, tribal nations, and others couldn't necessarily do that, we've been providing more direct support. And we're seeing the results of that in the application numbers. The number of first-time applicants, the communities that feel like they can now move forward and take action on their risk, is growing both for the hazard mitigation grant portfolio, but also our nonprofit security grant and our other preparedness programs. And so there is certainly a pent-up demand by communities across this nation to be prepared, to be ready to reduce risk and prevent the preventable.
Thank you. You know, in some of the smaller communities, you find that they don't have a technical grant writer. It's kind of like, well, you're not busy. How about filling out this grant for us? And now in this very competitive world, that's just not going to cut it. They're not going to be able to get the resources that they may need or even know that they are out there. So when you talk about technical assistance, does that help with hiring grant writers? Tell us a little bit more about those things.
Absolutely. Through the technical assistance we provide, there's a number of things that we're doing. And it's also many of our grant programs, like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, have management costs that states can use for the non-federal capacity they need to build. And so there's certainly different avenues through our programs to build that capacity that's needed. And the other thing that we are doing is making sure that, you mentioned, ma'am, the Community Disaster Resilience Zones legislation that had bipartisan support. It's also enabling us and other federal agencies to really prioritize those places that are most at risk and most in need, and provide even more proactive customer service and support to those communities to navigate both FEMA funding and other funding that will help them address their resilience issues. And so it's a multifaceted approach. These communities are facing complex interwoven challenges. We saw it last summer in DC. We had extreme heat, but Canada's wildfire smoke. This is a new world that we're living in with really interrelated hazards, and communities are wanting to tackle that holistically.
They don't just stop at the border, do they? The problems. Thank you. I'll yield.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for being here today. I'm trying to understand how you prioritize. Louisiana submitted 113 BRIC project requests before they received the first one. And I want to make note, they received the first one in year 3. I was actually very involved working with then Chairman Schuster and with DeFazio, right? Yeah, DeFazio, and establishing BRIC. I couldn't be more supportive of mitigation and resiliency efforts when they make sense, which I think what our chairman was getting to. Louisiana is one of the most at-risk states in the nation. I hear administration officials coming down to Louisiana and talking about sea rise and our risk all the time. It's very difficult for me to understand how it took 3 years and 113 project submissions before we get our first one, and then Washington, D.C. is getting one of the highest allocations in the country. This, I'll tell you, wasn't the intent of the program, and I'm just struggling with understanding how this possibly could be fair.
Thank you so much, sir, for that question. And I share your concern for the risks that Louisiana and other states and coastal communities are facing. And for your question around BRIC in particular, it is one of our competitive grant programs, right? As you know, Louisiana, we have a suite of grant programs, including the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which the state administers directly. And with BRIC, part of it is a state set aside. So every single state gets a portion that they can use as they see fit for their priorities. The other portion has been competitive. And that's where we continue to iterate and improve how we look at that so that every state, and one will see it in the numbers last year, every state will get.
I hear you, but I guess it's really difficult for me to understand how to reconcile the two things, that we're the most impacted state and sea rise is going to destroy our state and climate is going to ruin our future, yet we're getting no recognition. And so under FEMA's strategic plan, they list 3 goals. And I think that this is really the crux of why we're seeing these distorted allocations. FEMA talks about trying to address equity, climate resilience, and FEMA readiness. Can you tell me where in the Stafford Act those 3 things are?
Our strategic goals and our strategic plan are aimed at better helping us deliver on our mission.
Hang on, I want to make sure you understand the question. Can you tell me where in the Stafford Act those three objectives are?
The Stafford Act requires FEMA to provide our support without any discrimination. And these goals help us achieve that.
I appreciate your answers. It's not answering the question, though. Are those 3 things in the Stafford Act?
The Stafford Act requires us to deliver our support without discrimination, and these goals are how we operationalize that.
I'm going to ask you to stop. So you're not answering my question, and I think we both understand the answer is no. These are not in the Stafford Act. And so what this does is it results in distorted outcomes. Look, this is what I did for a living and committed much of my life to resilience of communities. Louisiana's lost 2,000 square miles of our coast. It's like wiping the state of Rhode Island off the map. If you come in and you use bad metrics that don't consider all of the risk, you're going to result in bad outcomes. You're going to miss opportunities. Look, I will agree with you. Climate is a risk. It is a threat. It is not the only one. And if we continue to sit there and myopically focus on it, we're going to miss opportunities to result in better outcomes, more resilient communities. And I think it's a very dangerous trajectory that FEMA's going down right now. I want to ask you another question. How do you consider risk rating 2.0 and that methodology in how you prioritize grants under the BRIC program?
The risk rating 2.0 has been the way that we now have actuarially sound pricing to make sure that for our national flood insurance program.
I'm familiar with what it is. How do you factor it in?
As I mentioned, we have a portfolio of programs, and those two are not interrelated. But what I would like to mention.
I'm running out of time. I apologize for cutting you off, but I just want to make sure. So that is not, that methodology, that criteria is not used to prioritize mitigation grants.
The BRIC program does not use risk rating 2.0.
Okay, thank you. I just trying to understand that. I want to make sure I did. So lastly, does that mean that the mitigation investments you make are totally separate from the risk rating 2.0 methodology, to where if you make investments, it is very possible that flood insurance rates don't even go down because there's a complete disconnect between the two?
Communities through our programs are addressing their most important disaster risks. And in Louisiana, for instance, the flood mitigation assistance program.
I'm sorry, I'm out of time. Is that a yes or a no? Is it,
Our programs reduce disaster risk, and they reduce disaster flooding.
Will it lower rates?
When communities take action to reduce flood risk, it does have an impact through the community rating system on lowering the policy premiums.
Yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Representative Larson. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the disaster relief fund is expected to run out sometime this August. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. And
so if that happens, the agency may be then forced to implement immediate needs funding again this summer if Congress does not pass the supplemental.
This administration submitted a $9 billion supplemental request last year to address that estimated shortfall in the disaster relief fund, and I fully support that request, as it will allow us to maintain the capacity needed for FY24 levels and ensure we can fulfill our mission.
So what's the short-term impact to hazard mitigation projects from FEMA having to implement the immediate needs funding?
For the hazard mitigation grant program, like the public assistance program, when we are in immediate needs funding, the focus is life safety. And that means that obligations slow down to those communities who are in active recoveries and investing in their resilience, which has
Can I put that in, I put that in English perhaps for you? It's a lot of FEMA talk and bureaucracy talk. What it'll mean is that some projects that were slated to get funding otherwise
Will be delayed.
will not get funding.
It'll be delayed.
Right, yeah, immediately will not get funding. They'll be delayed until, presumably until.
Until there's a
Congress acts
supplemental.
on supplemental. So we'll be in a position where we were, sometime last year? We did this, we went through this circus last year? Is that right?
We were in a situation of immediate needs funding last year as well, where payments had to be slowed because of the focus on life safety till there was a supplemental.
So and there's no way to get around that from FEMA's perspective.
From, as administration has requested, the approach for addressing the health of the disaster relief fund is the $9 billion supplemental request that was submitted last year.
Got it. So moving a little bit, the hazard mitigation grant program recipients are allowed to use a percentage of the funding they receive to manage that grant. So hearing from the emergency management folks in my state and presumably others, it takes a while to receive that funding. So they're essentially managing the grant on their own costs as opposed to being able to pay for that management. And delays in determining the amount of that funding that will be provided may be causing a backlog of projects at FEMA. So what is FEMA doing to work with our states to streamline that process to ensure state and locals can access those grant management funds in a more timely manner?
I, like you, am eager to see these grants awarded and to see shovels in the ground. That is a priority for us all. And
It's usually backhoes, but yeah. It's usually backhoes.
backhoes. We are making progress, and we are expecting to see the pace of the awards continue to increase in the near future. And so there's many things we're doing to get those grants out the door faster, from working with stakeholders more efficiently and transparently, promoting consistent decisions and awards, supporting our regions to facilitate that back and forth whenever information is needed, and to simplify our cost effectiveness methods. And so these are all things, given the extreme need, that we've been doing to really deliver the programs more effectively. And as I mentioned earlier, management costs are one of those things that states really rely on to be able to build the capacity they need to deliver on the projects funded.
Yeah, it's pretty critical because the states are the ones with their locals who are really doing the work here. So if you can continue to focus on that, I'd appreciate it. Given the critical nature of mitigation projects in communities at risk for disasters, it's important that these grants for projects are provided. Have you looked at the average length of time from award to receiving funding for BRIC grants and for hazard mitigation grant program grants?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Have you looked at the average length of time from award to receiving the grants for BRIC and for HMGP?
The timeline for the different grant programs varies, and our big focus is trying to expedite and tighten those timeframes from selection to review to award to implementation, because that's where we see the change in the world. And for the BRIC program, many of the projects that have been submitted are transformational in nature, and so they are larger scale projects and have more complexity to the review process before they can actually get built. Other projects are sometimes very small. We mentioned the Storm Revolving Loan Fund earlier. That's able to fund a lot of smaller dollar, $5 million and less projects really quickly because there's less complexity. So we have many different project types that are eligible across our programs, given the needs of communities vary. And the timeline oftentimes is very much woven in the type and complexity of the project a community is trying to undertake.
That's fine. Thank you. Yield back.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman from Washington. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Representative Zell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Salinas, for being here today, discussing these very important matters. I grew up in South Mississippi on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and unfortunately, that's a hot spot for hurricanes. And I will say that I've policed every hurricane in South Mississippi since 1979. And during my time as a sheriff there, I helped many communities try to recover from some of these events. And when Katrina hit, I ended up with 4 feet of mud and water in my house, so I understand. The effectiveness of FEMA's resiliency programs is critical for my district. I'd like to start with the grant program I think needs some improvement, the BRIC funding. Many studies have shown that states on the Gulf and in the Midwest have struggled to receive some of the competitive portions of the grant. Struggled may be a nice word because, as we heard earlier, and I was going to bring this up anyway, Mississippi has received no money from the program whatsoever. I think most would agree that Mississippi is a hot spot for natural disasters. What steps is your agency taking to ensure these funds are distributed more evenly?
Sir, thank you so much for your question. And I know firsthand so many of the challenges Mississippi has been facing. I was in Rolling Fork a couple years ago before the tornadoes, focused on the Mississippi River challenges with flooding. We have many different programs that are being used to reduce disaster risk, and there's progress being made in helping states and communities utilize them. Not only for BRIC, as you asked about, have we seen every state now be able to benefit in recent years and have projects selected. Through our SWIFT Current program, which is part of the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, we saw Mississippi in particular. It had been since 2009 that Mississippi hadn't benefited from the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, but with SWIFT Current and the incredible partnership between the state of Mississippi and our Region 6 and headquarters colleagues, they were able to access the new SWIFT Current to address flood risk issues in the state. And so the point here is that there are many tools. BRIC is one. It is competitive. There is the state set-asides. It has a tribal set-aside. But the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance, dam safety, there are so many tools, storm, that exist that we are working to ensure that communities and states and tribes are accessing to meet their unique needs.
Do you believe the program is working as it was intended to and allocating these funds to areas that have been most affected by the disasters?
For the BRIC program, or which one in particular, sir? Sorry.
The BRIC, do you believe it's been working as it was intended to?
BRIC was conceived as an opportunity to do more risk reduction before disasters occur. And we're seeing so much risk across this nation. And so the criteria, the approach to the competitive portion of BRIC is certainly helping communities do those more transformational projects. And the state set-asides are helping states and tribal nations for the tribal set-aside do that work. We also doubled the tribal set-aside over the last couple years in order tribal nations to tackle their resilience issues as well.
Many of the small rural communities in my district have told me they lack the resources to apply for hazard mitigation grants. I understand FEMA recently hired a small state and rural advocate, but beyond that, what's the agency doing to ensure rural communities have every opportunity to participate in these programs?
We too want to ensure that all communities, rural communities included, are able to build and invest in their resilience. And so, in addition to an advocate, our programs like the BRIC Direct Technical Assistance Program are helping many rural communities across this nation, from the south all the way to rural Alaska, to address their resilience needs. In addition, FEMA is partnering very closely with the Rural Partners Network. The training and education I mentioned earlier, we have rural partners that deploy training for emergency management and risk reduction to communities themselves. And so we have a comprehensive approach to emergency management and resilience building that is inclusive of the needs of rural communities. And like I said, we are trying to systematically dismantle those barriers that communities face, whether it's the cost effect, how to do a benefit cost analysis, whether it's hazard mitigation planning, all those essential things. Our teams are building our capacity to enable the state, local governments, and the communities they serve to invest in their resilience.
Thank you for that. And just so you'll know, we're still struggling to recover some of the funds from Katrina in 2005. And so, that just makes it even more difficult for our our towns and, when they're having to fork out a lot of money. So, we need your help, so let's get busy. Thank you.
Thank you
Mr.
so
Chairman,
much,
I
sir.
yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Representative Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Salinas, climate change has fueled an alarming increase in the number and severity of natural disasters across the nation. To better help communities prepare for the mitigation of the climate crisis, FEMA established the first community disaster resilient zones, including here in the District of Columbia, which I represent. How will these zones help the District of Columbia and other jurisdictions mitigate extreme weather events?
Thank you for that question, Representative. We share a desire to see resilience built across this nation, and there are so many needs that prioritization and working where there's the highest risk, highest need communities is exactly what the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act called on FEMA to do, and what it is enabling us to do in partnership with many others. So our intention with implementing the Community Disaster Resilience Zones is to build resilience across this nation in those most at-risk places. This new program, we established the first set of zones at the end of last year in every state in the District of Columbia, as you mentioned. And it's enabling us to do a couple of things. Not only did the legislation call on a better cost share, that's come up as a big barrier for many underserved and rural communities. So it's a 90% federal share for those projects, similar to for all of the CEDAR zones. It also called on us to collaborate better with other federal agencies. And so we are seeing other agencies use these resilience zones as ways to prioritize technical assistance and grant funding so that together we are driving and supporting resilience building in the areas that it's most critical. We are also partnering with other sectors, and so it's a great opportunity and a forcing function and a force multiplier to see the private sector, philanthropy step in, and in the Southeast United States, we've already seen certain philanthropies begin working with local nonprofits and universities to really support communities, both better understand the risks that they face, develop the plans needed to tackle it, and then mobilize the funding from multiple sectors to see those plans turn into concrete actions and benefits for people and communities. So it's been an incredible opportunity that we give great gratitude for Congress for that, for the bipartisan CEDARS legislation, as it will certainly be a new tool and a way to make progress in this nation.
Thank you. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program funds billions of dollars in pre-disaster mitigation projects at state and local levels. These projects will help our local communities better withstand extreme weather events. How have BRIC grants helped my district, the District of Columbia, and other jurisdictions become more resilient?
The great opportunity that BRIC and our other hazard mitigation grant programs have afforded communities is an opportunity to really invest in what they see as critical. So even here in the District of Columbia, last year I had an opportunity to visit DC Water, providing many of us perhaps sustainability and drinking water in our own homes, where flood risk and a natural disaster could create major challenges. And the District of Columbia wanted to make sure there was energy redundancy there. And so BRIC helped contribute to that project. And so around the nation, we are seeing communities being able to access these dollars to make sure their people are safe, that critical lifelines don't fail, and that we're preventing the preventable. Because particularly when we're talking about natural hazards and disaster risk, there is much we can do to prevent the human suffering that disasters cause, and BRIC and our many other programs are part of that solution.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Utah, Representative Malloy. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Salinas, thank you for being here. I've been sitting here listening. The nice thing about going last is that all the questions I intend to ask always get asked before I get to ask any questions. And so I just want to follow up on some of the things that have already been said. I was looking at the Stafford Act this morning, and it does say that one of the things FEMA is supposed to do, that Congress has told FEMA to do, is encourage states, individuals, and local governments to protect themselves. And then I'm sitting here listening, and what I'm hearing instead of that is that flood insurance rates are prohibitively expensive, and Congress isn't privy to the methodologies that are used to determine those rates. And success is being measured by how many grant applications are being submitted. Of course, local governments are applying for federal dollars. They're always looking for more income streams, but I don't think that is a measure of how successful the agency is being at meeting their mission and doing what Congress has authorized them to do. At-risk areas are not getting the grants they need, but Washington, D.C., the seat of all bureaucracy, is getting grants. This feels like it's just an example of what's wrong with bureaucracy. An agency that exists to assist in disasters isn't assisting the areas that have the most disasters. State and local governments aren't getting the assistance they need to protect themselves, which is one of the things that the agency is supposed to do. And rural areas, like a lot of my district, aren't qualifying for assistance. So some of the people who are the least resilient and need the most help aren't qualifying for it. And then we keep talking about an increase in disasters, but the increase in disasters isn't resulting in an increase in the quality of assistance. It's just creating more bureaucracy, and you've done a fairly heroic job here today of defending the agency and talking about what you're doing, but I'm not hearing answers that are satisfying to me as a member of Congress. We have oversight over the agency, and we have a responsibility to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being used appropriately. And all I'm hearing is that an agency that keeps asking for more and more taxpayer dollars isn't giving satisfying answers about how they're being used. And it seems like it'd be irresponsible for us to keep increasing funding for these programs that aren't doing what they were intended to do. If my colleague, Mr. Graves, was still here, I'd yield the rest of my time back to him so he could follow up on the line of questioning that he didn't get to finish. But I just want to say the most fundamental question we should be asking in this kind of a hearing is, why should taxpayers in a nation that's drowning in debt trust your agency with more taxpayer dollars? And I haven't heard a good answer to that question during this hearing. And if you want, I'll give you a minute to try to answer that, but it's going to have to be a different answer than what I've already been hearing.
Thank you so much, Representative. And we too are committed to ensuring that taxpayer dollars are building resilience across this nation. And so what we're seeing is that the number of applications coming in far exceeds the dollars that we have to invest. And there's a number of ways that we're looking at ensuring the benefit and streamlining support, because that is also key for us as well. And so across our programs, we've been reducing barriers to applying. We've also been making sure that there's technical support to many different types of communities to access those dollars. We also have been committed through lifting up great practices and supporting communities in designing projects, doing hazard mitigation planning, a whole suite of things that really makes it easier to access those dollars. And that's one of the fundamental steps, is reducing barriers. The other is providing support in communities to help them with the planning, both through BRIC DTA, through other mechanisms. We do provide that direct support to communities to be able to better leverage our dollars.
I would hope in this kind of a hearing we'd hear a plan for how these disaster-prone areas are going to get a higher priority for the grant programs that exist, and some actual concrete answers on what barriers are being broken down for underserved areas, including rural areas, and not just that you're doing it, but some proof that it's working. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from New York, Representative D'Esposito.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Ms. Salinas. So I represent the southwest corner of Long Island. It's an area that was not only crushed in Hurricane Sandy, but just months prior to that, Tropical Storm Irene devastated. I remember days following Hurricane Sandy, there were homeowners who still had the stickers on their appliances from replacing them from Irene that were now flooded out during Sandy. So during that time in 2012, I served as chief of the Island Park Fire Department. I was the incident commander during Hurricane Sandy. And obviously, I know how critical access to timely and sufficient funding was such a major challenge to emergency managers throughout Long Island. So I know that there has been a program put in place, the Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund Program, which aims to remove some of the barriers that communities face when seeking mitigation funding. I know that it's a new program started in 2021, and understanding that with any government program, there is often bureaucracy and red tape, especially when implementing a new program. And I was wondering if you can just briefly explain and tell me how the implementation of this program is going, and if you feel that it's been successful thus far.
Thank you so much, sir, and great to see you again.
Same here.
The Storm, our new revolving loan fund, is a great new tool in the portfolio of our hazard mitigation assistance programs. And in the first round of Storm, we had multiple jurisdictions, states apply for this revolving loan dollars, requesting more dollars than we had actually put out in that first notice of funding. And so we've been taking a test and learn approach because we're really committed to ensuring we're streamlining, reducing barriers, making our programs easier to access. And so there's certainly some lessons learned from this first round of funding that we are taking into the second round. But we are seeing multiple states already begin to use the Storm dollars. And some of those benefits that we're particularly excited about is that the Storm dollars can be used as match for federal funds, because that is one of the biggest barriers many communities face. It puts the cost-effectiveness requirements on the state so that that part is also easier for local governments and the states to manage on their own. So the nimbleness of this new revolving loan fund will be critical in addressing the many smaller dollar risk reduction projects that make a huge impact in communities. So a lot of lessons learned coming, but it's one of those things where this next round will be responsive to those changes that we've seen and heard from stakeholders.
And how have you done outreach to different communities? I mean, obviously, whether you're from Pennsylvania, from Utah, from New York, or anywhere else across this country, the resources that are needed, although the mission is the same when it comes to managing emergencies, very often those resources vary. So how are you making sure that you are connecting with emergency managers and municipalities from throughout this country, not just in the big places like, New York City, but in the smaller communities so that they have available the resources that they need in order to keep their community safe?
Thank you. Connecting with a broad range of stakeholders is key to mission success for us. And so in the numbers and even who's applying and first-time applicants, we see success in that we're having many new entities apply for funding. And that's due to very robust outreach that has taken the form not just of traditional webinars and pushing out information, but also proactive approaches. So even, we've been talking about grant programs today, but even in our exercise and training programs that we offer to local governments free of cost, we've been proactively reaching out to say, you are a community that is perhaps in a community disaster resilience zone. Have you taken advantage of this? Can we help you use these programs more? And so we're really changing our own approach to be more proactive and using risk information, using community disaster resilience zones designations, and listening to where there is that need so that we're proactively supporting communities to access the resources they need. And so it's been great to see the changes in applications come in as evidence of that outreach.
And I only have a few seconds, but I just want to leave you one last thing. Obviously, during the Biden administration, we've seen an obscene amount of wasteful spending in this administration that's going to cost our children and grandchildren for decades. I would just ask that you please make sure that we keep an eye on duplication of funds and wastefulness in this program. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not yet been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. Administrator, we thank you for your testimony, your timeliness, and your willingness to be here. At that, this subcommittee stands adjourned. All right.